Section 7 of The Three Impostors by Arthur Machen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Novel of the Black Seal, Part 1. I must now give you some fuller particulars of my history. I am the daughter of a civil engineer, Stephen Lally by name, who was so unfortunate as to die suddenly at the outset of his career, and before he had accumulated sufficient means to support his wife and her 2 children. My mother contrived to keep the small household going on resources which must have been incredibly small. We lived in a remote country village, because most of the necessities of life were cheaper than in a town, but even so we were brought up with the severest economy. My father was a clever and well-read man, and left behind him a small but select collection of books containing the best Greek, Latin, and English classics, and these books were the only amusement we possessed. My brother, I remember, learnt Latin out of Descartes' Meditationes, and I, in place of the little tales which children are usually told to read, had nothing more charming than a translation of the Gesta Romanorum. We grew up thus, quiet and studious children, and in course of time my brother provided for himself in the manner I have mentioned. I continued to live at home. My poor mother had become an invalid and demanded my continual care, and about 2 years ago she died after many months of painful illness. My situation was a terrible one. The shabby furniture barely sufficed to pay the debts I had been forced to contract, and the books I dispatched to my brother, knowing how he would value them. I was absolutely alone. I was aware how poorly my brother was paid, and though I came up to London in the hope of finding employment, with the understanding that he would defray my expenses, I swore that it should only be for a month, and that if I could not in that time find some work, I would starve rather than deprive him of the few miserable pounds he had laid by for his day of trouble. I took a little room in a distant suburb, the cheapest that I could find. I lived on bread and tea, and I spent my time in vain answering of advertisements, and vainer walks to addresses I had noted. Day followed on day, and week on week, and still I was unsuccessful, till at last the term I had appointed drew to a close, and I saw before me the grim prospect of slowly dying of starvation. My landlady was good-natured in her way. She knew the slenderness of my means, and I am sure that she would not have turned me out of doors. It remained for me then to go away, and to try to die in some quiet place. It was winter then, and a thick white fog gathered in the early part of the afternoon, becoming more dense as the day wore on. It was a Sunday, I remember, and the people of the house were at chapel. At about 3 o'clock I crept out, and walked away as quickly as I could, for I was weak from abstinence. The white mist wrapped all the streets in silence. A hard frost had gathered thick upon the bare branches of the trees, and frost crystals glittered on the wooden fences, and on the cold, cruel ground beneath my feet. I walked on, turning to right and left in utter haphazard, without caring to look up at the names of the streets, and all that I remember of my walk on that Sunday afternoon seems but the broken fragments of an evil dream. In a confused vision I stumbled on through roads, half town and half country, grey fields melting into the cloudy world of mist on one side of me, and on the other comfortable villas, with a glow of firelight flickering on the walls, but all unreal. Red brick walls and lighted windows, vague trees and glimmering country, gas lamps beginning to star the white shadows, the vanishing perspectives of the railway line beneath high embankments, the green and red of the signal lamps. All these were but momentary pictures flashed on my tired brain and senses numbed by hunger. Now and then I would hear a quick step ringing on the iron road, and men would pass me well wrapped up, walking fast for the sake of warmth, and no doubt eagerly foretasting the pleasures of a glowing hearth, with curtains tightly drawn about the frosted panes, and the welcomes of their friends. But as the early evening darkened and night approached, foot passengers got fewer and fewer, and I passed through street after street alone. In the white silence I stumbled on, as desolate as if I trod the streets of a buried city. And as I grew more weak and exhausted, something of the horror of death was folding thickly round my heart. Suddenly, as I turned a corner, someone accosted me courteously beneath the lamp post, and I heard a voice asking if I could kindly point the way to Avon Road. At the sudden shock of human accents I was prostrated and my strength gave way. I fell all huddled on the sidewalk, and wept and sobbed and laughed in violent hysteria. I had gone out prepared to die, and as I stepped across the threshold that had sheltered me, I consciously bade adieu to all hopes and all remembrances. The door clanged behind me with the noise of thunder, and I felt that an iron curtain had fallen on the brief passage of my life, that henceforth I was to walk a little way in a world of gloom and shadow. I entered on the stage of the first act of death. Then came my wandering in the mist, the whiteness wrapping all things, the void streets, the muffled silence, till when that voice spoke to me it was as if I had died and life returned to me. In a few minutes I was able to compose my feelings, and as I rose I saw that I was confronted by a middle-aged gentleman of pleasing appearance, neatly and correctly dressed. He looked at me with an expression of great pity, but before I could stammer out my ignorance of the neighbourhood, for indeed I had not the slightest notion of where I had wandered, he spoke. 'My dear madam,' he said, 'you seem in some terrible distress. You cannot think how you alarmed me. But may I inquire the nature of your trouble? I assure you that you can safely confide in me.' 'You are very kind,' I replied, 'but I fear there is nothing to be done. My condition seems a hopeless one.' 'Oh, nonsense, nonsense! You are too young to talk like that. Come, let us walk down here, and you must tell me your difficulty. Perhaps I may be able to help you.' There was something very soothing and persuasive in his manner, and as we walked together I gave him an outline of my story, and told him of the despair that had pressed me almost to death. 'You were wrong to give in so completely,' he said when I was silent. 'A month is too short a time in which to feel one's way in London. London, let me tell you, Miss Lally, does not lie open and undefended. It is a fortified place, fossed and double-moated, with curious intricacies. As must always happen in large towns, the conditions of life have become hugely artificial. No mere simple palisade is run up to oppose the man or woman who would take the place by storm, but serried lines of subtle contrivances, mines and pitfalls, which it needs a strange skill to overcome. You in your simplicity fancied you had only to shout for these walls to sink into nothingness, but the time is gone for such startling victories as these. Take courage. You will learn the secrets of success before very long.' 'Alas, sir,' I replied, 'I have no doubt your conclusions are correct, but at the present moment I seem to be in a far way to die of starvation. You spoke of a secret. For heaven's sake, tell it me, if you have any pity for my distress.' He laughed genially. 'There lies the strangeness of it all. Those who know the secret cannot tell it if they would. It is positively as ineffable as the central doctrine of Freemasonry. But I must say this, that you yourself have penetrated at least the outer husk of the mystery.' And he laughed again. 'Pray do not jest with me,' I said. 'What have I done? Que sais-je? I am so far ignorant that I have not the slightest idea of how my next meal is to be provided.' 'Excuse me, you ask what you have done? You have met me. Come, we will fence no longer. I see you have self-education, the only education which is not infinitely pernicious, and I am in want of a governess for my 2 children. I have been a widower for some years. My name is Gregg. I offer you the post I have named, and shall we say a salary of 100 a year?' I could only stutter out my thanks, and slipping a card with his address and a banknote by way of earnest into my hand, Mr Gregg bade me goodbye, asking me to call in a day or two. Such was my introduction to Professor Gregg. And can you wonder that the remembrance of despair and the cold blast that had blown from the gates of death upon me made me regard him as a second father? Before the close of the week I was installed in my new duties. The professor had leased an old brick manor house in a western suburb of London, and here, surrounded by pleasant lawns and orchards, and soothed with the murmur of ancient elms that rocked their boughs above the roof, the new chapter of my life began. Knowing as you do the nature of the professor's occupation, you will not be surprised to hear that the house teemed with books, and cabinets full of strange and even hideous objects filled every available nook in the vast low rooms. Gregg was a man whose one thought was for knowledge, and I, too, before long caught something of his enthusiasm, and strove to enter into his passion of research. In a few months I was perhaps more his secretary than the governess of the two children, and many a night I have sat at the desk in the glow of the shaded lamp, while he, pacing up and down in the rich gloom of the firelight, dictated to me the substance of his textbook of ethnology. But amidst these more sober and accurate studies I always detected a something hidden, a longing and desire for some object to which he did not allude, and now and then he would break short in what he was saying and lapse into reverie, entranced as it seemed to me by some distant prospect of adventurous discovery. The textbook was at last finished, and we began to receive proofs from the printers, which were entrusted to me for a first reading, and then underwent the final revision of the professor. All the while his wariness of the actual business he was engaged on increased, and it was with the joyous laugh of a schoolboy when term is over that he one day handed me a copy of the book. "There," he said, "I have kept my word. I promised to write it, and it is done with. Now I shall be free to live for stranger things. I confess it, Miss Lally, I covet the renown of Columbus. You will, I hope, see me play the part of an explorer." "Surely," I said, "there is little left to explore. You have been born a few hundred years too late for that." "I think you are wrong," he replied. "There are still, depend upon it, quaint undiscovered countries and continents of strange extent. Ah, Miss Lally, believe me, we stand amidst sacraments and mysteries full of awe, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. Life, believe me, is no simple thing, no mass of grey matter and congeries of veins and muscles to be laid naked by the surgeon's knife. Man is the secret which I am about to explore, and before I can discover him I must cross over weltering seas indeed, and oceans and mists of many thousand years. You know the myth of the lost Atlantis? What if it be true, and I am destined to be called the discoverer of that wonderful land?" I could see excitement boiling beneath his words, and in his face was the heat of the hunter. Before me stood a man who believed himself summoned to tourney with the unknown. A pang of joy possessed me when I reflected that I was to be in a way associated with him in the adventure, and I too burned with the lust of the chase, not pausing to consider that I knew not what we were to unshadow. The next morning Professor Gregg took me into his inner study, where ranged against the wall stood a nest of pigeonholes, every drawer neatly labelled, and the results of years of toil classified in a few feet of space. "Here," he said, "is my life. Here are all the facts which I have gathered together with so much pains, and yet it is nothing, no, nothing to what I am about to attempt. Look at this." And he took me to an old bureau, a piece fantastic and faded, which stood in a corner of the room. He unlocked the front and opened one of the drawers. "A few scraps of paper," he went on, pointing to the drawer, "and a lump of black stone rudely annotated with queer marks and scratches. That is all that the drawer holds. Here, you see, is an old envelope with the dark red stamp of 20 years ago, but I have penciled a few lines at the back. Here is a sheet of manuscript, and here some cuttings from obscure local journals, and if you ask me the subject matter of the collection, it will not seem extraordinary. A servant girl at a farmhouse who disappeared from her place and has never been heard of. A child supposed to have slipped down some old working on the mountains. Some queer scribbling on a limestone rock. A man murdered with a blow from a strange weapon. Such is the scent I have to go upon. Yes, as you say, there is a ready explanation for all this. The girl may have run away to London, or Liverpool, or New York. The child may be at the bottom of the disused shaft. The letters on the rock may be the idle whims of some vagrant. Yes, I admit all that, but I know I hold the true key. Look.' And he held out a slip of yellow paper. 'Characters found inscribed on a limestone rock on the Grey Hills,' I read, and then there was a word erased, presumably the name of a country, and a date some 15 years back. Beneath was traced a number of uncouth characters, shaped somewhat like wedges or daggers, as strange and outlandish as the Hebrew alphabet. 'Now the seal,' said Professor Gregg, and he handed me the black stone, a thing about 2 inches long, and something like an old-fashioned tobacco stopper much enlarged. I held it up to the light, and saw to my surprise the characters on the paper repeated on the seal. 'Yes,' said the professor, 'they are the same, and the marks on the limestone rock were made 15 years ago with some red substance, and the characters on the seal are 4,000 years old at least, perhaps more.' 'Is it a hoax?' I said. 'No, I anticipated that. I was not to be led to give my life to a practical joke. I have tested the matter very carefully. Only one person besides myself knows of the mere existence of that black seal. Besides, there are other reasons which I cannot enter into now.' 'But what does it all mean?' I said. 'I cannot understand to what conclusion all this leads.' 'My dear Miss Lally, that is a question that I would rather leave unanswered for some little time. Perhaps I shall never be able to say what secrets are held here in solution. A few vague hints, the outlines of village tragedies, a few marks done with red earth upon a rock, and an ancient seal. A queer set of data to go upon? Half a dozen pieces of evidence, and 20 years before even so much could be got together. And who knows what mirage or terra incognita may be beyond all this? I look across deep waters, Miss Lally, and the land beyond may be but a haze after all. But still, I believe it is not so, and a few months will show whether I am right or wrong.' He left me, and alone I endeavoured to fathom the mystery, wondering to what goal such eccentric odds and ends of evidence could lead. I myself am not wholly devoid of imagination, and I had reason to respect the professor's solidity of intellect. Yet I saw in the contents of the drawers but the materials of fantasy, and vainly tried to conceive what theory could be founded on the fragments that had been placed before me. Indeed, I could discover in what I had heard and seen but the first chapter of an extravagant romance, and yet deep in my heart I burnt with curiosity, and day after day I looked eagerly in Professor Gregg's face for some hint of what was to happen. It was one evening after dinner that the word came. 'I hope you can make your preparations without much trouble,' he said suddenly to me. 'We shall be leaving here in a week's time.' 'Really?' I said in astonishment. 'Where are we going?' 'I have taken a country house in the west of England, not far from Caermain, a quiet little town, once a city, and the headquarters of a Roman legion. It is very dull there, but the country is pretty, and the air is wholesome.' I detected a glint in his eyes, and guessed that this sudden move had some relation to our conversation of a few days before. 'I shall just take a few books with me,' said Professor Gregg. 'That is all. Everything else will remain here for our return. I have got a holiday,' he went on, smiling at me, 'and I shan't be sorry to quit for a time my old bones and stones and rubbish. Do you know,' he went on, 'I have been grinding away at facts for 30 years. It is time for fancies. The days passed quickly. I could see that the professor was all quivering with suppressed excitement, and I could scarce credit the eager appetence of his glance as we left the old manor house behind us and began our journey. We set out at midday, and it was in the dusk of the evening that we arrived at a little country station. I was tired and excited, and the drive through the lanes seemed all a dream. First the deserted streets of a forgotten village, while I heard Professor Gregg's voice talking of the Augustan legion, and the clash of arms, and all the tremendous pomp that followed the eagles. Then the broad river swimming to full tide, with the last afterglow glimmering duskily in the yellow water, the wide meadows, the cornfields whitening, and the deep lane winding on the slope between the hills and the water. At last we began to ascend, and the air grew rarer. I looked down and saw the pure white mist tracking the outline of the river like a shroud, and a vague and shadowy country, imaginations and fantasy of swelling hills and hanging woods, and half-shaped outlines of hills beyond, and in the distance the glare of the furnace fire on the mountain, glowing by turns a pillar of shining flame and fading to a dull point of red. We were slowly mounting a carriage drive, and then there came to me the cool breath and the secret of the great wood that was above us. I seemed to wander in its deepest depths, and there was the sound of trickling water, the scent of the green leaves, and the breath of the summer night. The carriage stopped at last, and I could scarcely distinguish the form of the house as I waited a moment at the pillared porch. The rest of the evening seemed a dream of strange things bounded by the great silence of the wood, and the valley, and the river. End of Part 1 of Novel of the Black Seal.